Hi, my name is Frances. I am bringing you notes from the fourth Pinnacle Bellwether trial that I attended on October 10th, 2017. For me, this was the most shocking part of the whole day of testimony. Dr. Thomas Schmalzried was on the stand. He's an orthopedic surgeon based in LA. He was also established already as a Johnson & Johnson DePuy consultant, and it's also been established already in this trial being held right now in the fall of 2017 that the company paid him about $30 million, give or take. And that's in addition to his practice as an orthopedic surgeon. That's just what he got separately from Johnson & Johnson, which is the parent company of DePuy. So anyway, Mark Lanier is the plaintiff's attorney for these plaintiffs who are suing Johnson & Johnson. These are bellwether trials. Basically, about 10,000 people have filed suit against Johnson & Johnson, saying these Pinnacle metal-on-metal total hip devices with which they'd been implanted have harmed them, did harm them, and that caused the need for painful, expensive, and very complicated revision surgeries and other things like that. There have been 3 previous bellwether trials. I did not attend the first one. The first ended with a verdict. That was just one plaintiff. It ended with a verdict in favor of Johnson & Johnson. I didn't go to that. I didn't know anyone who went to that trial. I've since heard that this patient had a lot of issues, and the doctor basically on the stand said that he put the device in wrong. That's the explanation I've been given for why the jurors sided with the company. I don't know if that's true or not, or where that case is in the appeals process. But the second trial was 5 plaintiffs who all lived here in Texas. The jury awarded them in March of 2016, when the trial ended, $500 million. Then the judge, because of the laws governing tort reform here in Texas, the law mandated that he reduce that amount, which he did, to $150 million. That's when I first became aware of this. I was trying to learn more about my device, and I stumbled upon an article online about this verdict, and I was like, huh, that's a lot of money for just 5 people. Like, what in the world? Why could the jurors have come up with that? And so I started looking into this, and I stumbled upon the fact that the doctor I was actually seeing at the time, that the company had tried to bring him in to testify against his own patient. And then I looked him up online, and the Doctors for Dollars, or Dollars for Doctors, ProPublica website, and saw how many hundreds of thousands he had made in the years I was seeing him. And then it suddenly clicked for me. Wow, he's been telling me the Pinnacle's great, even though some days I'm coming to his office in a wheelchair. Maybe there's something to this, and that's why I started looking into all this. Anyway, that was the second trial. The third trial involved plaintiffs from California. I did go to the closing arguments of that trial, and I did know someone who was in the trial, and that person was giving me information about what was happening in the trial. So, you know, my eyes were opened a little more with the third bellwether trial. And that, in that case, the jury came back in December of last year, 2016, with a verdict in favor of the plaintiffs, the patients, and said that Johnson & Johnson DePuy would have to pay them $1.2 billion. That's about $500 million each. So again, I'm like, wow, this evidence must be really damning. So this is the fourth bellwether trial, and I just felt like if I could go and see it for myself, see the evidence, you know, I could get some clarity on, hey, are these bad or good? Have I been lied to? Or, you know, is this just hype? You know, legal hype. That's what they try to tell you, that, oh, everybody's just getting hyped up because it's a chance to make money. So I wanted to go see the evidence for myself. So that's what I did October 10th. And this is, I believe, the third video I've made about, I took notes in court that day. I took, in the end, 50 pages of notes, handwritten. And that's what I'm using to make my notes here. So I'm probably a biased courtroom observer for sure. Not an objective reporter, not pretending to be. I'm not a paid reporter, I'm not being paid by anyone. I just want to find out what's going on. And I figured there were lots of other people like me who've had trouble from the beginning with these devices, and we're just trying to get some clarity because, our doctor says we're fine, and then we find out our doctor's making $600,000 per year as a consultant for this company. So it kind of skews everything. This is the Pinnacle Johnson & Johnson DePuy total hip replacement device. It's a metal ball on a metal stem, which is a different product actually. And then it's the ball, and then a liner, and then the cup, which gets implanted into the pelvis. So it's basically 3 metal parts that fit together, and the liner is called the Ultimate, and that's what I have. The Pinnacle had several options for different type of, you could have a ceramic ball and a ceramic liner, or you could have a metal ball and a plastic liner, or ceramic ball and plastic. And these cases are all involving people who have what I have, a metal ball and a metal liner and a metal cup implanted in the pelvis. So I got 2 of them when I was 39 in 2011. I was told they basically didn't have any wear at all when they took them off the simulation machines, and that what the doctor had put in me would basically never have to be replaced. It's since been taken off the market. About a year and a half after I got them, the company pulled them from the market, saying they just weren't selling very well anymore. It was sold to younger, more active patients like me. I definitely did not do like most hip replacement patients do after surgery. I would say I just never got any better from that surgery. In fact, I kind of got worse after the surgery. And so I spent the next 4.5 years quite disabled. I didn't limp because it was both legs that were affected and both hips that hurt. I couldn't stand without pain. I had pain around the clock. It kept me up at night. I definitely couldn't, I say I couldn't walk. I could walk, but it hurt, so I didn't walk because it hurt so much. And you can't take painkillers the rest of your life. So my husband and I just decided, look, if you're hurting, sit down. So I couldn't stand enough without pain being low enough to do basic housework chores or take good care of my kids like I wanted, doing laundry and putting it away, walking up down steps, bending to do dishes and put them in the dishwasher. It just wasn't an option. I sat on a sink stool if I wanted to do some dishes. So it was definitely awful. In addition, my upper body, my face, head, neck, shoulders, back, and chest broke out in these painful boils that would swell. They were bigger than acne bumps, and they would crack open and bleed or ooze this clear liquid. I would definitely say I had disordered moods for the first couple years, and greatly reduced ability to sleep, which, who knows, did that come from the chronic pain, the fact that I had the surgery to give me my life back, and instead it was making it worse. I couldn't be active enough to get tired at night. And then, of course, all the stress and fear related to losing my ability to function, work, support my family, etc. Who knows? I definitely am doing better now, though, 6 years later. I developed tinnitus, ringing in the ears that was constant and would keep me up all night. I feel like I became shockingly forgetful almost immediately after getting these hips. Like, I've always been airheaded, but it was shocking. At one point, one of my last days of work, when I tried to go back to work, I had a doctor's appointment midday, 1 o'clock or so, 1:30 maybe, and I'd lived in this town for 10 years, and so I was coming back from the doctor's appointment, and I got lost on the interstate. Like, this is the interstate, the main and only interstate that runs through town, and I suddenly didn't know where I was, and it was scary and confusing and embarrassing and weird, and I've had a couple more incidents like that, but it was really bad, especially at first. I definitely would say I have some visual disturbances, though nothing anybody can detect on scans yet, but I'm getting checked next week for hearing loss. An echocardiogram I had done shows a thickening of the left ventricular wall and the septum, which are positively associated with cobalt poisoning, and that is supported by medical literature related to some cases more than a decade ago in which people were killed actually because one beer company started adding cobalt as an anti-foaming agent to the beer, and so everyone started having cardiomyopathy, and it killed some people, and they traced it back to the cobalt. So anyway, the cobalt tends to thicken your heart and scar it or stiffen the heart, and as you know, the heart needs to pump. So if it's stiff, it doesn't pump. So they've definitely already measured that in the left ventricular wall and my septum, which is spooky. And then Mars MRIs from last year, they're special MRIs that are metal suppression MRIs. That's what you have to have from now on if you have a metal hip. And it showed what are known as pseudotumors forming in both my legs. I would call these like pockets of lymph and the immune cells that typically attack foreign invaders in the body. So it's little collections of debris, fluid, and these immune cells. They're not an actual tumor, which is why they're called pseudotumors. So when a surgeon goes in to take out the hip replacement device and quote, clean out the pseudotumor, he's not actually grabbing a tumor. It's not cancer. It's more like a lesion. Sometimes they open the people up and it's black, yellow, or gray fluid in there. And then when they're removing the pseudotumor, they're actually just cleaning out the area that it has destroyed. So they're picking out the necrotic or dead or black muscle tissue and just basically trying to clean up areas where the muscle tissue has been destroyed. So those have been already located in both my legs. About a year and a half ago, my pain got a lot better for some reason. I'm still hurting a lot though by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I skate every day, which gives me a little bit of pain relief for a couple hours, which is good. But then even though I consider this level of pain like, okay, acceptable relative to the first 4.5 years, now we're learning that the metal poisoning really is an issue. All along, the cobalt and chromium in my blood have both been as high as 4.0, which doesn't sound ridiculous, but it's the point at which, let's say if I'd been exposed to these heavy metals in my workplace, OSHA would have already shut down my workplace if my levels had been coming from occupational exposure versus from inside my body. And so, yeah, basically I'm a biased observer to this court case. My real problem is it's bad that the companies are doing this, putting untested medical devices on the market. I say untested, meaning that they were never tested on humans in clinical trials. They were tested on simulators, but never in a real person before they were sold. And there's something called 510K, which is a provision in the law that governs how these devices get to market, and that's my real beef is with 510K. It's, the companies are doing, I guess, what they're allowed to do, but a lot of people consider this 510K provision in the law a loophole that needs to be closed. So that's my problem with it. So anyway, Mark Lanier is the Houston-based plaintiff's attorney in this case, and he's questioning on this day, October 10th, Dr. Thomas Schmalzried, as he's been doing the entire day. This is about the third part. Excuse me. Lanier enters Exhibit 1716 as evidence. It's a paper, written by Thomas Schmalzried. It's called Optimizing Patient Selection and Outcomes with Total Hip Replacement. It came at a time when Johnson & Johnson was trying to develop its own hip resurfacing device. That's basically just a little cup that fits over the femur that has a little stem into it, so you don't remove the whole head of the femur when you do this hip resurfacing surgery. Smith and Nephew had a product called the Birmingham, which was really taking the market share. A lot of people were really into the Birmingham and wanting it because you didn't have to remove as much bone, so that's a good thing. And so all the other companies were just like, oh, we got to find something to go against the Birmingham. They were nibbling away at everybody's market share. So this paper, as Lanier shows in court, he puts it up on the overhead projector. It was he's showing the part where it says this research was supported or paid for by the Piedmont Fund of the LA Orthopedic Hospital and Wright Medical. And Lanier turns to Dr. Schmalzried, who did the study, and says, "Did Wright pay you?" And Schmalzried says, "Wright gave money." Lanier says, "You got money through the Piedmont Fund, didn't you?" Schmalzried says, "I wasn't getting money from the Piedmont Fund. I never took money from the Piedmont Fund," even though it just said it on the paper that we all saw. Lanier says, "Let's look at the Piedmont Foundation and funding in detail." And then he pulls up Schmalzried's presentation that he had made before, a professional presentation called Big Balls and Thin Liners. It was a PowerPoint presentation that Schmalzried had given in the past, and he pulls the slide up and reads from it, which says, "This presentation supported by DePuy and the Piedmont Foundation." Lanier says, "The Piedmont Foundation is you, Dr. Schmalzried." Schmalzried says, "I am a principal in it, but it's not me." Lanier says, "The funnel of money into the Piedmont Foundation is coming from Johnson & Johnson DePuy. You run the funding through the Piedmont Foundation so it doesn't tie Johnson & Johnson or DePuy to the funding of the studies that look at Johnson & Johnson DePuy devices." Then he says, "It looks like Steve Haas and his brother Brian Haas," these are two doctors who are also brothers, "are doing the exact same thing as you." And he talks about this email that Brian Haas had sent that says, "If DePuy gave an unrestricted grant funding to the lab, that money could not be linked to the project." So he's trying to say, this is how you guys sidestep, and the funding doesn't get tracked as coming from the company whose devices are being studied. Lanier says, "You did the same thing on a number of occasions." Schmalzried says, "Not that I recall." Lanier says, "You formed the Piedmont Foundation." Schmalzried says, "Yes." Lanier says, "You formed it as a not-for-profit entity, a 501c3, and Schmalzried says, "Yes." Lanier says, "You got exempt from state and federal taxes, so companies can contribute to it without paying taxes on the money they were contributing. DePuy could put money into it, and it would actually be a tax deduction. You were the president of the foundation. Your wife, Michelle, was the secretary and CFO, and that was it. There were only 3 officer positions in the Piedmont Foundation. You held 1 and your wife held 2. Then," Lanier says, "Johnson & Johnson would give checks to the Piedmont Foundation, and you would cash the checks and do studies, and then you would say in the articles or the write-ups on those studies that the studies were funded by the Piedmont Foundation, not Johnson & Johnson DePuy." Then Lanier submits into evidence Exhibit 5014. It's a bunch of checks from Johnson & Johnson DePuy Orthopedics to the Piedmont Foundation. Lanier says, "DePuy pays you, as the foundation, so that you can do clinical research." Schmalzried says, "I don't know what the funds were for." Lanier says, "Clinical research was done with some of this money." Schmalzried says, "These checks may have paid for clinical research." Then Lanier goes on through the multiple pieces of evidence. He cites page 133, checks for clinical research, 136, a check for clinical research, 140, a check for clinical research, 147, clinical research, and he goes through. Lanier says, "You wrote up articles and funneled money through the Piedmont Foundation that was actually money from Johnson & Johnson DePuy. Y'all use this like Haas did to hide the sources of money." Schmalzried says, "No, that mischaracterizes what the Piedmont Foundation did." So to me, as a person with 2 of these hips put in my body, to me as somebody who now I go to a doctor and he tries to look up articles, and if he finds an article like this, he'd be like, "Oh, it says the metal's not that bad," and he doesn't know that the Piedmont Foundation is supported by money from the company that made my device. So that was really shocking and depressing for me to hear, because I know that, my general practitioner, for instance, looks up and depends on the medical literature, and if the medical literature is covertly funded by the companies that are promoting these products, it's not really science, and that's terrifying. So I hope this helps you in your decision and what to do with your hips. And I'm just kind of dumbfounded by it. So thanks for watching.